Chapter 1. The Reckoning. The therapist's office was painted a shade of beige, so neutral it seemed designed to absorb personality. The bookshelves were fake wood. The couch cushions were too soft. The ticking of the clock was too loud. Much too loud. Hermione Granger was about to get a headache if it didn't stop soon, she felt. It just kept going on and on and on, so, Dr. Locke said gently. "How are you today, Hermione?" Hermione stiffened a bit, blinking as she looked up at her therapist. She pulled the sleeves of her cardigan tightly over her wrists as she looked into Dr. Locke's warm brown eyes through those rimless glasses. Dr. Locke had such large eyes. For such a thin face, it was hard not to look at them. "Fine, thank you," Hermione said crisply, then corrected herself. "I mean emotionally stable. My sleep has been irregular, but not distressingly so, and I think it's because at school there are these really big tests coming up, and I want to get the top mark, of course. Oh, and also, I've finished 6 books this week. Non-fiction, mostly. But actually, I did read a German novel, though I found the narrative structure irritatingly self-indulgent." Dr. Locke blinked once. "You've been busy." Another blink. "Another German novel. I like to keep my mind active," Hermione said. "Passive consumption of grief or trauma doesn't speed recovery. It simply calcifies the memory. And the development of a focused interest can help in the wake of a traumatic event. Yes, I suppose perhaps learning the German language is mine." Dr. Locke nodded, looking intently at Hermione. "Yes, your parents have told me of your sudden fascination in that area," she said slowly, smiling. "You even requested a private tutor and everything, right?" Hermione nodded quickly in affirmation. "And is it what? Helping?" "Yeah," Hermione breathed out, forcing her smile to widen. It's really helped, Dr. Locke. And my progress has been very impressive, according to Mr. Wagner. He says he's never seen such progress in someone my age." She beamed, as if in class, and she had just gotten the right answer. But unlike with the comprehensive school she now attended here, there were no right answers. At least that was what Dr. Locke had said their first meeting. "I also read a biography, by the way," Hermione added suddenly, still smiling widely. It was of Nerida Volchanova, her mind supplied helpfully, the most famous historical witch in all of Bulgaria, Catherine the Great. "She was certainly a very powerful woman," said Dr. Locke, nodding. "Do you see yourself in her?" Hermione fiddled with the edge of her cardigan sleeve, winding the yarn tightly around one finger. She hated lying. She wasted lying. "Well, I would hope I'd be better to the serfs," Hermione joked, laughing a bit. "But I don't know. I mean, she had a goal. She knew how to pretend. She knew when to keep her mouth shut." That made the therapist pause, pen still in hand. "And do you feel like you have to pretend, Hermione?" Hermione stiffened, swallowing. "My parents want me to talk about it, I suppose." "The incident," Dr. Locke prompted gently. "Which is a vague and unhelpful term, don't you think?" Hermione asked, pursing her lips. "It was an act of school negligence resulting in a violent event, and yet we keep referring to it like a tabloid headline." Dr. Locke adjusted her glasses. "How would you prefer to refer to it?" "I was injured. Very badly. I was found alone and bloodied and unconscious in a lavatory. I was 12 years old, and I should not have been put in that position." "That's fair. But that's not the part that stays with me," Hermione added, her voice quickening. "The part that stays is I remember thinking knowing that I was going to die, and being angry about it, not scared, just absolutely furious." "Why angry?" "Because I hadn't finished everything I wanted to learn yet." Dr. Locke raised her eyebrows. "You were angry because you were dying before you finished learning?" "Yes," Hermione said, sitting up straighter, suddenly animated. "Is that really so strange? People die unprepared all the time. It's horribly inefficient, isn't it? I mean, think of all the dreams buried before they could become reality. And we act like I'm such a victim for surviving, when in reality, the most horrible thing that happened to me was the aftermath of a world of magic just." Hermione cut herself off. "You were about to say something." "You said a world of magic." "I mean metaphorically. Hermione lied panikedly, a little too fast. It's a literary turn of phrase. Metaphor is a valid therapeutic framework, isn't it? Dr. Locke didn't reply immediately. She made a note on her pad instead. Hermione strained to read it upside down but couldn't. You know, Hermione, it's okay to talk about things the way they really are, Dr. Locke said eventually, leaning forward slightly. You're not being graded here. Hermione frowned. I'm not trying to be graded. I'm trying to be curate. Accurate, Dr. Locke repeated, but not necessarily honest. I'm not dishonest. There are things you wouldn't understand. Try me. She saw Dr. Locke's hand twitch toward the notepad, but not quite write anything. That was always the game. How much could Hermione say without raising alarm? Without bringing in her parents again, wringing their hands like she was some broken girl they couldn't fix? What could she possibly tell her? That she'd been 12 and cornered in a freezing stone bathroom by a 12-foot mountain troll with breath like rot, and a club that had cracked the wall inches from her face. That had eventually found its target hand struck. That if her professors hadn't come, she would have been dead. That she had felt something split open in her afterwards when she had woken up in the hospital wing. Not from fear, not even from pain, but from awe, because she should have died. And instead, she lived. Healed with magic she never saw, by adults who said everything will be fine in voices that were too loud and too quick. Magic had been the force that had both broken and rebuilt her. Magic, her parents had decided, had to go. After the troll, her parents had demanded answers. Professor McGonagall, Hermione's head of house, had tried to explain gently that these things were rare, that Hogwarts was safe. Within a week, they'd taken Hermione home. Do you feel safe at home? Dr. Locke asked suddenly. Good, Hermione thought, relaxing slightly. Change of subject. I won't let anything slip then. I suppose, Hermione said, shrugging. It's safe when nothing really out of the ordinary ever happens. My parents run their own dental practice, so they're really busy. After school, I just read a lot in my room. So unless I'm worried about death by 1,000 paper cuts, Hermione laughed slightly, then there's nothing to fear. Nothing to get excited over either, Hermione thought to herself. But in time there will be. I'm trying to move forward, Hermione added suddenly, watching Dr. Locke watching her. Good, the woman said, making a small note. Moving forward is good. Hermione simply nodded, smiling. She didn't say that she already had. After the troll attack, Hermione's parents thought they could kill the witch in Hermione and bury her without a trace. That given enough time and love, everything could go back to the way it used to be, before Professor McGonagall had arrived with that fateful letter in hand only months prior. But it couldn't. Hermione tried to beg them, and even bargain with them, telling them all about the other magical schools besides Hogwarts she could possibly attend. They had shut her down, time after time. There had been a moment where Hermione had genuinely thought about giving up. And then she glanced at the list of the 11 preeminent wizarding schools and saw one she hadn't told her parents about. Its location was secret, its headmaster was strict, its culture was brutal, and its admission policy, no Muggle-borns. Thankfully, she wasn't going as Hermione Granger. Afterward, when the session ended and her mother came to collect her car ride silent, tea already made at home, Hermione retreated to her bedroom with the same phrase she always used. I have reading to catch up on. She locked the door. She pulled the loose floorboard up beneath her bed and took out, atop a small pile of books, the leather folder that held her false documentation. Forged documents that were perfectly in line with the style of a similar document she had seen while reading the dissolution of Wizarding Prussia. How Germany created Grindelwald, parchment certificates of lineage written in Old German, and a fake wand registry card for her actually Ollivander-made wand, with the name Hermione Morgenstern etched in green. And beneath it all, her wand. Vine, dragon heartstring, and 10 3/4 inches long, still warm to the touch despite months of disuse. Hermione beamed, her bushy hair practically crackling with excitement as she held it. Because in mere months she would walk into Durmstrang Institute, the most feared magical school in Europe, under a name that wasn't hers. Chapter 2. Lies, Lies, Lies. The pale sun rose slowly over Hampstead Garden suburb, gilding the tops of the neat hedgerows and the perfectly aligned houses that lined its cobbled streets. The houses were all rather large, each striving to outdo the others in charm. Stone cottages with pastel-painted shutters stood next to red-bricked Georgian mansions, their neatly pruned gardens bordered by wrought iron fences. Ferry Row had never been known for being an awfully loud place. It was composed, mostly, of intellectuals, semi-retired academics, and professionals who valued quiet as a hallmark of civilization. Most here did not have children that weren't yet adults, and if they did, those children likely weren't the sort to raise much of a ruckus, which made Hermione Granger a bit of an outlier. Not because she was particularly noisy, though she could. If someone got their facts wrong about the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt or claimed that lightning never strikes the same place twice, but because she was, to put it kindly, restless. Her mind moved faster than Ferry Row had patience for. And these days, she was hiding quite a lot. Currently, she was sitting cross-legged on her bed in her upstairs room, a pencil between her teeth and 3 open books fanned out around her. One was in Latin, one in German, and one was a tattered collection of magical genealogies printed on faded yellow parchment. The door was locked, as it always was. Her parents thought it was lingering trauma, a way to cling onto a sense of security and whatnot. Her room, at first glance, was the tidy space of a bright and bookish teenage girl. Framed photos, certificates of achievement, color-coded bookshelves. But Hermione had developed a second organizational system beneath the visible one, an entire hidden library nested under floorboards, behind her dresser, and even within the false bottom of her toy chest. Transfiguration, foundations and function, volume ear charms through language and gesture-natural magic, principles of alchemical ecology arithmetic constructs and their calculated histories, and the list of Durmstrang coursebooks went on, both for the first and second years. That wasn't even counting the stacks of parchment she'd filled with historical dates, magical theory, and sample entrance exams she'd created herself, based on each book, all of which she had read cover to cover at least twice. Because in a few weeks she would sit for the Durmstrang Institute entrance examination if they bought her lie, that is, and if she failed, there wouldn't be a second chance. Not for Hermione Morgenstern, orphaned half-blood, daughter of a German curse-breaker and a British muggle. Not for the carefully spun lie Hermione had spent months constructing from scratch. Not for her. Her stomach tightened at the thought. She reached across the bed, flipped a page off-jams through language and gesture, and scowled. The German prose was dense, convoluted, and infuriatingly precise, despite the fact Hermione had spent months at this point practicing German. It was still a struggle to read through it. But Hermione had already read through this book once, and had annotated it thoroughly, yet, rereading it, she still felt like a beginner. If they expected her to pass subjunctives in the middle of a timed examination, then she would. She had to. Downstairs, she heard the muffled clink of teacups and Mum's light voice, probably reminding Dad about some appointment at their dental practice. Hermione sat still, pencil poised midair, listening. Hermione padded down the carpeted stairs, tugging the sleeves of her jumper over her hands, as though they might shield her from the sunlight streaming through the tall front windows. The smell of toast and marmalade drifted from the kitchen, along with the faint hum of the radio set to the BBC morning news. Dad was already at the table, spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose as he read the Times, though not with much seriousness. Every so often, he hummed along with the news jingles or muttered wry commentary to himself, punctuating it with a chuckle. "Morning, sweetheart," Dad greeted brightly, the lanky, bespectacled man glancing up from his newspaper as she walked in. "You're up early. Big plans. Revolution. Overthrow of Western philosophy. Just reading," Hermione said, smiling back at him. "And technically, Western philosophy has already overthrown itself several times over." Mum sat ramrod straight in her chair, hair pinned into its usual neat bun, buttering her toast with brisk efficiency. She glanced up at Hermione, her sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "There you are," Mum said. "I was beginning to think you'd barricaded yourself in again." Hermione's smile slipped slightly. "Just studying." "Of course you were," Dad said warmly, folding down his paper to beam at her. "Though I do hope you'll spare us a moment's conversation before you vanish back upstairs to commune with your dictionaries. Sit, sit." He pulled out a chair with a flourish, bowing like a butler. Hermione obliged, perching on the edge of the seat. Mum sipped her tea and eyed her daughter. "I suppose you're working through more German this morning. Mr. Wagner says your comprehension is remarkable for someone your age. But then, you have a tendency to grind yourself to the bone." "I'm fine, Mum," Hermione said quickly, reaching for a piece of toast to keep her hands busy. "It's just I want to be thorough," Dad chuckled. "Thorough? You've been thorough since you were 5. Don't let her fool you, Emma. This is what she does for fun. German, Latin, history books the size of our heads, ancient family trees of people, none of us have heard of. It's all practically recreation for her." Hermione's lips twitched. "It's not recreation. It is when you make me try to conjugate verbs at the dinner table," he teased, wagging his finger. "Your mother nearly strangled me when I asked her to pass the butter in the accusative case." Mum gave a delicate sniff, though there was a faint glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "That's because you declined it incorrectly." Dad roared with laughter, nearly spilling his tea. Hermione's smile faltered at the edges. The warmth of their banter only underscored the knot in her stomach. She wanted desperately to keep this moment safe, normal, but all she could think of was the ticking clock, the exam, the lie she was spinning tighter with each passing day. She spread marmalade across her toast without tasting it. "I think I'll go to the library today," she said suddenly, the words rehearsed in her head spilling into the quiet between them. "I need to check a few things for a project I'm working on." Mum blinked. "It's summertime, Hermione. It's an extracurricular project," Hermione said quickly, "and the library's quiet, easier to concentrate." Dad winked at her over the rim of his tea. "Translation, she's already preparing to take her GCSEs." Hermione ducked her head, feeling her cheeks heat. Mum, though, was still watching her closely. "Don't overdo it," she said at last. "Stress is useful in moderation. Beyond that, it makes people brittle." Hermione nodded, throat tight. If only Mum knew. She excused herself a few minutes later, slipping on her jacket and going upstairs to stuff her fake documentation as Hermione Morgenstern into her bag. Dad called after her to bring him back a novel if she passed the fiction shelves. Mum reminded her not to loiter. When she left, Hermione closed the door behind her and stood on the step, letting the cool air rush against her face. For a moment she simply breathed, heart hammering. Then she walked briskly to the corner, past Fairy Row's manicured hedgerows, until she reached the tube station. She bought a ticket with steady hands, but when the train pulled up, she slipped inside, eyes darting, every nerve thrumming with fear and anticipation. She wasn't going to the library. She was going to Diagon Alley. The leaky cauldron was quieter than she remembered from her brief weeks at Hogwarts. Morning light slanted through the grimy windows, catching dust motes and the faint haze of pipe smoke. Hermione kept her head down as she crossed the creaking floorboards, pulse racing. No one looked twice at her, just another witch's daughter running errands, but she felt exposed all the same. She slipped into the small brick courtyard, tapped the familiar pattern with her wandless fingertip, and watched the wall unfurl into the arched gateway. Diagon Alley opened before her, bustling even this early, and her throat tightened with the same strange mixture of longing and fear it always did. Focus. Get in, get out. Gringotts loomed at the far end, white marble gleaming, goblin guards standing at attention. Hermione kept her steps even, rehearsing in her head. "Like to make an exchange, please. Nothing suspicious about that." She was just a schoolgirl with Muggle coins. No one need know her name. No one need question her. Inside, the bank smelled of polished stone and parchment. She queued behind a wizard in plum-colored robes, her hands clammy around the envelope of coins in her satchel. When at last she reached the counter, the goblin clerk peered down at her with pale, appraising eyes. "Exchange," he rasped. "Yes, please," Hermione said, placing the folded notes on the counter. Her voice sounded too loud, too thin, but the goblin merely swept the bills into a drawer and returned with a clinking pouch. "5 galleons, 7 sickles, 2 nuts," he recited, sliding it across. Hermione managed a nod. "Thank you." She hurried out before her nerves could betray her, clutching the little leather pouch tight against her chest. Outside, Diagon Alley had fully woken. Vendors hawked quills and enchanted toys, owls hooted restlessly from wicker cages, and the cobbles echoed with the chatter of witches and wizards. Hermione ducked into a quieter side street, heart pounding. First stop, the Owl Post. She had folded the letter twice over, sealed it with red wax, and scrawled the address in careful German script. Durmstrang Institute of Magic Office of Admissions. She whispered it under her breath as she entered the shop, as though the repetition could fix it firmly in the world. The owls blinked down at her from their perches, feathers rustling. "One to Durmstrang Express," she told the witch behind the counter, handing over the sealed envelope and a sickle for postage. The witch tied it to a sturdy-looking eagle owl and sent it off into the sky. Hermione's stomach lurched as the bird vanished into the blue. It was done. Her lie was out in the world now, flying toward the one place that could either destroy or save her. She pressed her satchel tighter to her side, but the worst was over. Because the next part of her trip was getting even more books. After all, even if she had read the Durmstrang course texts a dozen times, there had to be more supplementary treatises, obscure journals, anything to deepen her cover. Perhaps, deep down, Hermione just wanted more books to simply read them without a greater purpose, but she'd never admit that. Flourish and Blatz wouldn't have what she needed, but sometimes second-hand stalls carried oddities from the continent. She threaded back into the crowd, head lowered, the pouch of galleons heavy in her hand. Hermione kept to the edges of the street, eyes skimming over the windows of apothecaries and robe shops, until she reached the little cluster of stalls near the end of Diagon Alley. The second-hand book merchants had claimed the shaded corner beside an ironwork fence, their goods stacked high in lopsided towers. Hermione felt herself relax, letting the smell of leather and dried ink and parchment overtake her for a moment. Books were safe. Books were good. She moved carefully from stall to stall, scanning crooked labels in cramped handwriting, runes for the practical historian, a theoretical approach to transvection, charms of the Baltic region. She lingered there, fingers brushing over the cracked spine. Anything foreign was valuable. Anything that would make her German heritage seem more natural and harder to doubt. "Rare import, that one," the bookseller said, a wiry wizard with bulging green eyes. "Picked up from a trader out of Riga, 2 galleons." Hermione's lips thinned too much. She was about to shake her head when she caught sight of another title in the pile, Einfach Zaubersprüch Preußenst. Her breath caught. Simple spells of Prussia in German. Perfect. She handed over the money before she could second-guess herself, clutching the heavy volume to her chest. Her satchel was already half full by the time she stepped back into the sun, weighed down with a slim volume on Baltic spellcraft, a water-stained translation Aufgusses of the North, and a battered textbook that went over the intricacies of the freezing charm. She should have stopped. She knew that. But if she just had a little more, just one more edge, Hermione froze. No, she thought desperately. Please, God, no. Still, against all her instincts, she turned, hoping that she was just imagining it. By Fortescue's sat a knot of ginger-headed folk, the Weasleys. A plump, kind-looking woman with red hair, who Hermione assumed was Mrs. Weasley, had shopping bags tucked at her feet, talking to a short little girl that had hair as flaming as hers. Mr. Weasley craned his neck at the enchanted display in the window of the broom shop across the way. The Weasley twins licked their ice creams, chattering. Percy was buried with his thin nose in a book, as always. And there, standing just a little apart, staring straight at her with wide eyes, was Ron Weasley. For a heartbeat, Hermione couldn't breathe. The last time she'd seen him was when her parents had taken out of Hogwarts, because of the troll, of the bathroom, of the name he had called her. Ron was staring at her now, half squinting, like he wasn't quite sure he believed his eyes. "Hermione," he said again, louder this time. Hermione swallowed hard, heart hammering in her ears. Her satchel seemed to burn against her side, forged documents, Durmstrang texts, her whole fragile future crammed inside. If he came closer, if he looked, his mouth hung open for a moment before he blurted, "Blimey, it is you." Hermione's stomach lurched. Before she could turn away and run like she wanted to, Ron was already walking to her, his freckled face caught between astonishment and relief. "I thought you," he trailed off, words tangling. "I mean, I heard you'd withdrawn, that you weren't, that you'd left, for good, after everything." The troll flashed in her mind, sudden and merciless. Stone walls, stink of sweat and rot, the club swinging down, her own scream echoing, "Oh." "Hello, Ron, yes, well, things change." Ron rubbed the back of his neck, looking more awkward by the second. I'm glad, though, to see you. I wasn't sure if you'd," he stopped, swallowing. Are you coming back?" "For next year." Hermione's fingers dug into the leather cover of the book she was holding. If he only knew. She'd spent every night for months buried in German, memorizing foreign course lists, weaving lies over lies, just to have the faintest chance at magic again. And here Ron was, freckle-faced and earnest, asking as if she could simply walk back into Hogwarts and pick up where things had ended. Suddenly, she felt the urge to punch that stupid face of his. Instead, she smiled. I don't think so," she said, trying to sound casual. Her voice cracked anyway. "My parents don't really trust magic after that. They might take me out of my comprehensive and plop me into grammar school, though. I've applied to a few, but, well, we're still deciding." Ron blinked, brow wrinkling. "Comprehensive? Grammar? Is this all Muggle, then?" "Yes, all Muggle," Hermione said, her smile straining slightly. "But of course, that doesn't mean I'm ignoring my magical education. That's why I'm here in Diagon Alley. Just because I can't practice doesn't mean I can't read." Ron shifted, eyes darting toward where his family waited. Then, as if a thought had burst out before he could stop it, he leaned forward. "You know it's safe now, right? That night the troll, it wasn't just bad luck. Quirrell let it in. Me and Harry and Neville, too, we figured it out. There won't be anything like that again. You don't have to worry." Hermione stared. The words sank like stones in her stomach. "Professor Quirrell?" she asked, shocked. "A professor did that? That's unbelievable." "I can't believe he would do that, especially Professor Quirrell, of all people." She shook her head and forced a smile then. "It's really great, though, that you all solved it, and that Neville helped, too. I know he felt really alone at Hogwarts while I was there. And yet Neville had never sought her out of his own free will, no matter how much she had helped him. He had been perfectly content to rely on her, but never to be her friend. But once she was gone, he had befriended the two boys who had hurt her the worst, who had ruined her life. At that moment, she now had two more names to add to her mental list of people she hated beyond Belai over Ron's shoulder. Hermione could see the Weasley family spotting her, their eyes widening. She waved at Percy. She had always liked him, at least. "So," she began awkwardly, looking back at Ron, "I don't think my parents will re-enroll me into Hogwarts, no matter what, but I'll try to share that fact with them. How were your final exams, then? I hope you got better with your levitation charm." She let out an uncomfortable laugh. Ron smiled tightly. "Yeah, I got better at that one at least. I did fine in all the exams. Not bad, but not nearly as good as you would do, obviously." "Oh, I'm sure I wouldn't do that well if I tried," Hermione said, laughing. "It's quite easy to get out of practice with magic, especially if you never cast a spell since Halloween." There was an uncomfortable silence. Her grip on the strap of her satchel tightened until her knuckles whitened. "Anyway, congratulations on being a hero and all," she said suddenly, forcing the words through stiff lips. "I'm glad Hogwarts is safe now." Ron flushed, looking both proud and sheepish. "Thanks, and I really hope you come back. You'd be brilliant, you know. You always were," even if he bit the end off, teeth worrying his lip. Hermione gave him her best imitation of a polite smile. "We'll see," she said, voice thinner than parchment. "Anyway, I have to get going. Really busy. Still, great to see you." "You too." Ron gave her a small, almost hopeful grin before loping back toward his family, his ears scarlet. Hermione stood frozen, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She blinked hard, shoved the book into her satchel, and turned away. There were more shelves to scour, more knowledge to hoard. Books would never leave her crying in a bathroom. Books wouldn't abandon her. Books were safe. And so, Hermione left the side vendors, instead going down the alley all the way to Flourish and Blatz, slipping into the large bookstore hurriedly. There were more options, despite the higher price. It had nothing to do with the fact that she wanted to get as far as possible away from Ron Weasley, she convinced herself. It was a towering mess of shelves and books, of all different shapes and sizes and colors. She didn't gawk at them wondrously, instead aimlessly walking around. Her eyes flicked across a shelf stacked with thick, leather-spined volumes on spell theory. Normally, she would have snatched one up eagerly, tracing the gilt titles with her fingertips, breathing in the ink and parchment. Instead, she stared without really seeing, her throat tight. Quirrell was gone. Hogwarts is safe. The words should have been a balm, but instead they stung. If Hogwarts was safe, then what excuse did she have for not telling her parents? Maybe they'll understand, she told herself, chewing on her bottom lip. Maybe they'll let me go back. Other parents had never liked magic much, had they? They had hid it, but Hermione knew both disappointed that all that the big plans they had for her bright future were disrupted. The troll had just been the straw that broke the camel's back. Hermione had begged them to consider so many other magical schools, and they had refused. Whether or not Professor Quirrell was gone, she still couldn't believe a professor had been the one to do such an awful thing. They wouldn't budge. And worse, they would ask how she had learned that. Thenthe could find out about her plan. They could ruin everything. Hermione couldn't tell them. She steeled herself before tugging down a copy of Still Life, Still Magic, a treatise on advanced animate to inanimate transmutational pauses. Her chest eased just slightly as the familiar weight of knowledge pressed against her hands. This was what mattered, not Ron, not Neville, not any of them. Knowledge, preparation. Chapter 3. Walk Through the Fire. Durmstrang took quite a while to respond, Hermione found. She studied endlessly, and the days blurred into one another German flashcards, marginalia spilling across her ledgers, diagrams of wand arcs drawn until her wrist ached. Her parents grew fretful at her increasingly reclusive behavior. They thought this would have subsided after the sessions with Dr. Locke, not increased. Of course, they didn't know what her true goal was. On this particular afternoon, she was hunched over Rheinfasch Zauberspruch Preussensed, a rather thick primer of basic German spellwork. She had already annotated nearly every margin with translations and comparisons to other bits of magical theory she knew, her quill flying in rapid, sharp strokes. Her eyes narrowed at the name of yet another spell, Zauber der Stummenbindung, when a shifting shadow crossed her desk. Hermione frowned and tilted her head toward the window. A distant black speck was bearing down on Fairy Row. She leaned closer, brow furrowing. Then bang. The black owl slammed headlong into the glass, with such force that Hermione gave a startled yelp, her quill splattering ink across her notes. The bird flapped its wings furiously, feathers pressed awkwardly against the pane, and gave her a glare of unmistakable reproach, as though she had engineered the collision. "Oh, honestly," Hermione muttered, scrambling to undo the latch. If you bothered to approach at a more reasonable angle, the owl burst through the opening the instant it was wide enough, showering her neat piles of notes with dust and grit from its feathers. It hopped onto her desk, one clawed foot extended imperiously, and gave a low, commanding hoot. Hermione's pulse quickened. There was a seal crimson wax stamped with the stark, angular crest of Durmstrang. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. "Finally," she whispered, half breathless, half scolding, like a reprimand to a dawdling postman. "Do you have any idea of how long I've been waiting? Durmstrang really ought to improve its response time. The owl merely clicked its beak and began fussing with its feathers, utterly indifferent to her reprimand. Hermione smoothed the parchment flat with ink-stained fingers. The black seal cracked open cleanly, leaving the red wax in two broken halves. Inside, the script was sharp and deliberate, written in a hand that brooked no frivolity. And as Fraulein Hermione Morgenstern, it is with due formality that we acknowledge your candidacy for admission to the Durmstrang Institut. You are hereby summoned to sit for the entrance examination, to be held on Friday, the 3rd of July, promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning. Examination topics will include: candidates must present themselves prepared with wand and proper identification papers. Enclosed within this correspondence, you will find a small token of brass, marked with the Durmstrang seal. This object has been designated a portkey and will activate precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, local London time, on the day of examination. It shall transport you directly to the Institute. Be advised, failure to appear at the proper time and place will be interpreted as a forfeiture of your application. No second attempts will be granted. We extend neither reassurance nor apology, only the assurance that admission to Durmstrang is a privilege, never a promise. Für den Schulleiter, Master Ulrich Kappel Durmstrang Institute at the bottom. A tiny brass disc clinked against the parchment, no larger than a coin, its surface stamped with a jagged rune that seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight. Hermione lifted it gingerly between thumb and forefinger, heart thundering. Hermione's heart was thudding so violently she thought the owl might hear it. She read the letter once, twice, then a third time, lips moving faintly as she traced each word with her finger. No second attempts, she whispered aloud, her voice brittle. No second attempts, as though I meant to just know everything perfectly, as though German subordinate clauses are hardly confusing at all. Oh, just perfect. She dropped the parchment onto her desk and seized the portkey between two fingers again. It was warm, somehow, faintly humming, as though alive with restrained impatience. She half expected it to wrench her away immediately, but it remained inert, only the jagged rune gleaming up at her. It's ridiculous to feel nervous already. Entirely ridiculous. I've revised well everything, haven't I? Every single course book, twice over, and I've written my own notes and translated the most difficult passages myself. And oh no, what if the examiner asks for subjunctive German? Or worse, dialect? Her quill trembled in her hand as she darted to her ledger, scribbling down yet another list: conjugation drills, revision of Goethean idioms, reread Einfach Zauberspruch Preußenst for common incantation structures. Then she stopped abruptly, eyes darting back to the brass token. Her mouth went dry. A portkey, real magic. Not a spell she had stumbled through in her bedroom, or a charm half borrowed from books, but true, sanctioned, institutional magic. Hermione's hand twitched toward it. She wanted desperately to try something, anything to confirm it was all real. That, on exam day, she'd touch it, and it would take her to Durmstrang, to magic. But the words of the letter rang in her ears. No second attempts. If she damaged the portkey, or somehow exhausted its enchantment and ruined everything, shoved it back down on the parchment as though it had scolded her. Oh, stop it, she muttered furiously to herself, pacing the room. Her hair bounced with every step. You're clever, exceptionally clever. That's what all your teachers have always said, even the Hogwarts ones. And now you'll prove it, you'll simply have to. You won't let some freckle-faced boy and a troll define you forever. Her throat tightened. Ron's astonished face in flourish and blots swam up unbidden, the question he'd asked her still echoing. Are you coming back? She forced herself down at her desk again, spine stiff, as if posture alone might keep her afloat. Durmstrang isn't Hogwarts, she told the portkey in a prim, clipped voice, as if it could hear her. And I'll be ready, entirely ready. She focused back one Einfach Zauberspruch Preußenst then. Her quill scratched furiously across the page, but her gaze kept darting back to the coin, each time her pulse leaping. She half expected it to glow or spark, or worse, to vanish entirely if she dared blink too long. By the time her mother called her down for supper, Hermione had already filled 12 new pages of notes, though it all seemed like just a blur to her. The smell of roasted chicken and thyme drifted up the stairs, tugging Hermione at last from her desk. She tucked the letter into her satchel, the portkey wrapped in tissue, then hidden under a stack of spare parchment, as if burying it deep enough might conceal her own nerves, and went down. The dining table gleamed with polish, the candles already lit. Dad sat at the head, sleeves rolled up, cheerfully carving. "Ah, there she is. I was starting to think you'd gone and married that German dictionary of yours." Hermione flushed. "I was studying. It's important." "Of course it is, Poppet," Dad said, winking at Mum. "Though I confess, I'm not sure Goth's going to help with your maths results." Mum, precise as ever, dabbed her mouth with her napkin before speaking. "I worry, darling, that you're using all this extracurricular revision as a way to avoid people. You spend hours upon hours shut away. That rather defeats the purpose of Dr. Lark's sessions, doesn't it?" Hermione speared a carrot far too viciously. "I'm not avoiding anyone. I just want to be ready. You said yourselves, preparation is everything." Mum's brows arched, skeptical. Dad chuckled lightly, cutting himself a slice of chicken. "Preparation is one thing, Hermione, but you're beginning to sound as if you're sitting the bar exam rather than year 9. Hermione's throat tightened. The portkey seemed to thrum against her memory. She forced her voice into primness, as though crisp articulation might hold the lie together. "Actually, I was thinking about next year. I've been considering, applying to a very selective boarding school." That got their attention. Dad paused with the carving knife halfway through the breast. Mum's eyes narrowed, sharp and appraising. "A boarding school," Mum said slowly. After we've gone to such lengths to keep you home, comfortable, supported, now you want to vanish to some institution." "It isn't like that," Hermione blurted. She swallowed, straightening in her chair. It's rather elite, very rigorous. They only accept the brightest." "And they've taken an interest in me." Dad's eyes lit up. "Elite, you say? Well, well, that does sound impressive. Where is this place, then?" Hermione's mind went utterly blank. "The Truth Durmstrang Institute, likely somewhere in Northern Europe, German-speaking, world-renowned for dark arts," crowded on her tongue. She forced it back. "Germany," she said quickly, then winced. Too quick, too bald. She softened, primly adding, "It's very traditional, of course. A sort of classical education with modern enhancements. German boarding schools are renowned for rigor. It would look quite well, rather spectacular, on university applications, wouldn't it?" Mum's gaze sharpened like a scalpel. "Germany," Dad, on the other hand, broke into a grin. "Well, that explains the Goth. Thought you'd gone peculiar with the poetry. So you've been planning this, HM. Very enterprising." Hermione tried to smile, but her lips felt stiff. "I only want to make the best possible use of my time. And if I can set myself apart." Mum cut her off, dry and precise. "Germany is a far cry from Hampstead, Hermione, and I find it curious that you mention this now, without even a brochure, let alone formal correspondence. Forgive me if I sound unconvinced." Hermione's heart thudded so hard she feared the brass coin upstairs might hear it. She clasped her napkin tightly in her lap and forced herself to meet Mum's gaze. "I'll have it all soon," she said primly, though her voice wavered. "Very soon," Dad chuckled again, pouring her a glass of water. "Well, if it's as grand as you say, Poppet, we'll want to see the letter when it comes. And perhaps a bit of that famed German efficiency in their paperwork, eh?" Hermione's fork trembled in her hand. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, of course." Dad chuckled again, pouring her a glass of water. "Well, if it's as grand as you say, Poppet, we'll want to see the letter when it comes. And perhaps a bit of that famed German efficiency in their paperwork, eh?" Hermione's fork trembled in her hand. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, of course." Mum set down her teacup with a decisive clink, her eyes fixed on Hermione, sharp as needles. "What's it called?" Hermione froze. Durmstrang rang in her ears, too strange, too obviously foreign, too magical. She swallowed, then primly lifted her chin. Schloss. Falkenstein Internat, she said, remembering that the names of many prestigious German schools began with Schloss, and Thatenterstadt was the German word for boarding school. Falkenstein, though, was just a random place that popped into her mind. Very old. Very traditional, Morgenstern, Mum repeated, her brow creasing. German for morning star, yes, she tapped her lip thoughtfully. I don't recall ever hearing of it. Where exactly is it located? Hermione's hands twisted in her napkin under the table. Northern Germany, by the Baltic. Rather remote, but that's part of its academic rigor. No distractions, Dad grinned. Sounds bracing. Bet they make the students run on the beach at dawn. Mum, unimpressed, pressed on. And what sort of subjects do they emphasize? Classics, the sciences. Language and literature. Hermione took a shaky breath. She could hear her own voice turning precise, pedantic, the very tone she always used when quoting from textbooks. All of those. It's our multidisciplinary. They put great stock in languages and our cultural history. And physical training as well, to encourage resilience of mind and body. Rather a holistic philosophy, actually. Dad raised his glass, amused. Resilience, eh? Sounds like boot camp. Mum's gaze sharpened further. And who recommended this place to you, Hermione? Headmistress, Dr. Locke. One of your tutors. I assume someone must have, because I can't imagine you plucked a boarding school in northern Germany out of thin air. Hermione's heart thudded. She forced herself to meet her mother's eyes and said primly, Mr. Wagner mentioned it once when I was asking about traditional schools in his country. I looked it up after. It's obscure but very selective, the sort of place that produces distinguished scholars. And don't worry, I'd still take my GCSEs and A-levels and all that. For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the clink of Dad's fork. Hermione thought she might faint under Mum's scrutiny. Then Dad cleared his throat cheerfully. Well, I say we wait until this letter turns up. If they're as keen as you say, Poppet, they'll surely send something official. Proof in black and white. Until then, he winked at Hermione. Let's let the roast chicken have a fighting chance, shall we? Hermione forced a small laugh, and then forced herself to eat, despite the churning in her stomach. The days crawled toward July 3rd with the agonizing slowness of dripping wax. Hermione filled every second with study, as if sheer volume of knowledge could anchor her against the storm of nerves gathering inside her. She set herself schedules: 30 minutes of arithmancy problem sets, 1 hour of German verb drills, 45 minutes memorizing wand gestures and their etymologies, but no schedule could ever feel enough. Each time she closed a book, a wave of panic struck. What if I've forgotten something? What if they test me on an obscure law of transfiguration that wasn't in any book I've read, even the supplemental ones? What if my accent makes them laugh? Mum and Dad grew steadily more concerned. Dad joked, gently, that she was in training for the Olympics of book reading. Mum said less, but her disapproving silences weighed on Hermione far more. When Mum found her at the table scribbling German declensions onto napkins, she only sighed and said, You're making yourself brittle, Hermione. You'll crack under your own weight. Hermione didn't answer. She couldn't. On July 1st, she went to bed at 9 o'clock, determined to sleep properly. By 12:47 a.m., she was wide awake, heart thudding, hair sticking to her damp forehead. She got up, pulled on her robe, and crept to her desk. Transfiguration. Foundations and function, volume E lay there, the spine already cracked from obsessive handling. She opened it to the chapter on elemental transformation, tracing her finger over the familiar diagrams. She mouthed the passages silently, lips moving faster and faster until the words blurred together. She already knew every line, but knowing wasn't enough. What if she slipped? What if, at the crucial moment, her brain went blank? The clock ticked onward, merciless. At 3:14, she was still bent over the desk, scribbling annotations she didn't need. By July 2nd, she was pale and hollow-eyed. Mum pressed her lips together at the breakfast table, withholding comment, though her gaze lingered. Dad tried to cheer her with jokes, but even he grew quiet when Hermione excused herself for the fifth time that day, retreating back upstairs. And then July 3rd arrived. Hermione had managed only a few scraps of sleep before dawn. Her body felt leaden, but her mind buzzed with panicked clarity. She dressed with stiff precision. Jumper, skirt, satchel packed with ledgers and quills she wouldn't even need. Her eyes flicked to the tissue-wrapped portkey hidden in her drawer. It seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. She carefully took it, placing it into her satchel. Downstairs, Mum and Dad were finishing toast, already dressed for work. It was 7 o'clock, and their first patient likely wasn't due until at least 9, but they ran their own practice and always had to be on top of things. Dad beamed at her, though his smile faltered slightly at her expression. Big day, pop it. Hermione could only nod, throat too tight to speak. Mum handed her a folded £5 note for lunch in town if she was going to be out for long, watching closely as Hermione tucked it into her satchel. Don't work yourself into a frenzy, Mum said dryly. It's unbecoming. Control is the mark of intellect, Hermione. Remember that. Hermione managed a prim little, yes, Mum, though her voice squeaked. And have a great day at the practice. Hope you're panned. Then she was out the door, heart hammering. She needed to be somewhere private to activate the portkey. Somewhere nowhere in the right mind would go. The local library was quite an empty place just before 8 o'clock. The morning staff had barely arrived, the tall windows still misted from the damp summer air outside. Hermione walked swiftly down the carpeted aisles, her satchel bumping against her hip, and found one of the small private study rooms at the far end of the second floor. She slipped inside, turned the lock with trembling fingers, and pushed her chair under the transom to block the thin pane of glass in the upper part of the door. Her breath came quick and shallow. She set her satchel on the desk and carefully began changing. First came the plain black working robes that used to be her Hogwarts uniform, slightly too short now, the hem brushing just above her ankles, thanks to a growth spurt she hardly noticed at the time. Then she pulled out the winter cloak she had bought a year before in Diagon Alley, white and fluffy, lined with a subtle warming charm. She drew it tightly around her shoulders, relishing the faint hum of magic that coursed through it. It made her feel safer, steadier. She tugged on her fuzzy socks, blue, with tiny stars Mum had given her at Christmas, and slipped her feet into sturdy boots. At last, Hermione drew the satchel closer. The letter from Durmstrang lay folded inside, its words etched into her mind. Wrapped carefully in tissue was the brass portkey coin. She laid it on the desk, staring at it as if it might leap away if she blinked. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly. 7:58. Hermione's mouth was dry. She pulled one of her ledgers toward her, running her eyes over notes. She had already memorized arithmetic constructs, transfiguration definitions, verb conjugations in careful German script. None of it helped. Her fingers shook. 7:59. She clenched her fists in her lap, forcing herself to breathe evenly. This was it. Everything, every late night, every lie to Mum and Dad, every desperate page of German vocabulary led to this moment. 8:00. The portkey pulsed under her hand, a sudden warmth spreading through the brass. Hermione grabbed it, clutching it so tightly her knuckles went white. There was a tugging sensation, sharp and irresistible, yanking her behind her navel. The library desk, the walls, the ticking clock, all of it spun away in a rush of color and wind. Hermione gasped as her body was pulled through the void, faster and faster, until the world snapped back into being with a thud that jarred her knees. She landed in a crouch, boots against carved black stone. The impact rattled her bones, and she staggered once before straightening, breathing hard. Her cloak swirled awkwardly in the sudden shift of air, and Hermione immediately realized she didn't need it. The landscape around her was raw and stark. Jagged mountains loomed like stone titans in the distance, their peaks scarred white with old snow. Thin lakes shimmered like mirrors far below, catching and reflecting the blinding sun. The air was sharp, bracing, but unexpectedly warm, far warmer than she had imagined. Sunlight struck her face with a dry brilliance, almost marking her thick cloak and fuzzy socks. She shifted, uncomfortably aware that she had dressed for winter in the middle of an unforgiving northern summer. The wind carried the scent of frost and pine and untouched earth, filling her lungs with something raw, almost violent in its purity. And towering in the distance, set into the foot of a glacier-worn cliff, was Durmstrang. It looked less like a school and more like a fortress. The castle rose in rigid lines of blackened stone, 4 stories tall and utterly unadorned. There were no banners or crests, no golden weathercocks or decorative battlements, just bare, brutal architecture that had survived both war and weather alike. Its walls swallowed the sunlight without gleam, its angles precise and severe, as though the very rock had been commanded into obedience. There were no torches lit not for light, nor for warmth. Hermione remembered what she had read. Here, fire was conjured only for necessity, never for comfort. Fire was for magic and purpose, not indulgence. Her heart fluttered uneasily as she clutched her satchel tighter, standing on the black stone platform that served as the portkey landing. This was not Hogwarts with its whimsy and warmth, its portraits and shifting staircases. This was something else entirely. Despite the warmth, Hermione shivered, pulling her cloak tighter as she stepped out of the stony ring just as a figure approached. A tall man in crimson robes, severe and wiry in build, his dark hair buzzed close to his scalp. His wand rested in a silver-buckled sheath at his hip, and he moved with the precise silence of someone who had no need to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Miss Morgenstern?" he asked. The words were in German, of course, and Hermione's mind scrambled for meaning. Yes, he's saying her name. And he's asking yes, yes, confirming her identity. She straightened her spine. "Yes, I am Hermione Morgenstern," she replied slowly in heavily English-accented German, doing her best to sound confident. He gave a short nod. "I am Master Ulrich Capel, Transfiguration Master. I will take you to the examination." Hermione dipped her head slightly, repeating back with great care, "It is a great honor to meet you, Master Capel." No smile, just another nod. He turned on his heel and walked toward the path leading to the school without a word. She hurried to follow, translating in her head with careful precision. He meant accompany, didn't he? Or maybe he meant he'd administer it. No, definitely accompany. They passed under a stone archway, the gate ahead unlatched by silent spellwork. The doors did not creak, they simply parted at Capel's gesture like obedient hounds. Inside, the air cooled. Not the warmth of hearths, but the chill of old stone holding back summer's heat. The corridor was wide, but bare. No portraits laughed or whispered, no tapestries softened the walls. Every line was straight, every surface plain and functional, as though decoration itself were a waste of discipline. It was unnerving, almost. Hermione's eyes darted, drinking everything in runes carved faintly into the flagstones, the odd flicker of charm light pulsing above like cold stars, and the faint tang of iron in the air. Master Capel did not look back at her once, his stride steady and unrelenting. Hermione clutched her satchel close and forced her boots to match the sharp rhythm of his steps. This is it, she thought, pulse fluttering. This is really it. No turning back now. Eventually, they reached a circular chamber with a high, arched ceiling. At the far side sat a long desk carved from dark pine, inlaid with protective wards. Behind it sat 3 adults in robes of red and charcoal, each with a wand laid neatly in front of them. The woman in the center had iron-gray hair in a tight knot, cheekbones sharp as knife edges, and an expression that didn't so much judge as measure. Capel gestured silently to the center of the room, where a single wooden chair waited. Hermione sat. The gray-haired woman leaned forward and asked, in clipped, formal German, "Name?" "Hermione Morgenstern." Hermione replied instantly, throat dry. "Age, 12 years, 5 months and 1 week. I was born on January 27th, 1980. Overboard, Hermione knew. But she had a tendency of rambling, especially when lying. Place of birth, London. She cleared her throat and added, but raised very briefly in Stuttgart as a toddler. She had practiced this story over and over. Her father had been a German curse-breaker, her mother a British Muggle, both tragically killed during a field expedition gone wrong. She had been placed with Muggle guardians, the Grangers, at the Ministry's request. Technically plausible, thoroughly fabricated. The woman continued. Questions about wand length, wood type, core, about her fictional magical schooling, about the books she'd read, about her command of the core disciplines, and then the one she had practiced most. Why Durmstrang? Hermione inhaled through her nose. Discipline, she answered, carefully enunciating. A rich magical tradition, an emphasis on rigorous study and research. And she hesitated slightly, trying to be diplomatic. A history that does not romanticize itself. A pause. The grey-haired woman's brow arched just slightly. Hermione hoped that meantrospect and Natrid flag. Then, without preamble, she was dismissed from the room and escorted down a side hall for the written portion of the exam. The test was long, brutal, unrelenting. Hermione was given a chair at a stone table in an empty chamber and presented with a thick scroll of questions and an enchanted quill. The sand in the silver hourglass turned over, and she had 2 hours. She was halfway through the first page before panic truly set in. It wasn't the content, she knew the content. Magical theory, historical precedent, advanced arithmetic structure, and transfiguration stability matrices. She'd studied this. She'd drilled it for months. Some of the historical dates weren't even in English textbooks yet, but the language. She found herself rereading questions 2, 3 times, parsing verb cases, second-guessing pronoun modifiers, translating obscure terms in her head, and hoping they meant what she thought they meant. One particularly dense section had her blinking hard to keep from spiraling. Polaris interplay with arithmetic knots weight, is that dissolve or disrupt? She worked until her fingers ached, pushing through mental fog. She wrote and rewrote, and then rewrote again. She made references to sources no one her age should know existed, and she only realized she'd reached the end of the scroll when the final question faded and her quill snapped clean in half. The practical test was next. A cold chamber with staggered spell stations, each one overseen by a different professor. Hermione was handed a scroll with a long list of expected spells. A basic shield charm, transfiguration of a matchstick to a needle, levitation, a controlled fire-starting charm at first. It was straightforward, at least on paper. But her wand hand trembled ever so slightly, and her breath was shallow in her chest. Her shield charm flickered lower than it should have. The transfiguration worked, but she needed a third flick to get the texture right. By the time she reached the levitation task, she was sweating through her blouse again, and her internal critic was already writing the letter of rejection. As her eyes flicked down, she noticed more advanced spells, though. Spells that she wouldn't have known if she hadn't read the second-year course books or her supplemental readings. And then, even further down, spells she didn't know at all. She completed the final task she could with precision, at least, but there was half the scroll left untouched. Hermione closed her eyes, suppressing her own horror, and bowed slightly before stepping back. But Professor Capel did not speak. He simply just jotted something down. He reminded her of Dr. Locke, in a sort of way. Hermione was led to a waiting room, small, cold, and windowless. She sat, hands clasped in her lap, and stared at the wall for what felt like an hour. She ran mental calculations, reviewed her answers, catalogued every error. I should have said substabilizing instead of harmonizing in the fourth response. Misunderstood the third clause in the historical essay prompt because of my awful German skills. My levitation charm was weak. How humiliating a bad levitation charm is what took magic from me in the first place. But now, it's my lack of skill. That's not even to mention I couldn't even do half of the spells. Why did I even think that? The door creaked open. Capel stood there, impassive. Behind him, the grey-haired woman from the panel waited, hands folded, expression unchanged. Hermione rose so fast her chair scraped. Hermione Morgenstern. the woman said in that same clipped, measured German. Come, Hermione followed, pulse thundering in her ears. They did not return to the circular chamber, but to a narrower room with a single table. A sheet of parchment lay upon it, blank except for her name. The woman sat. Capel remained standing at her shoulder like a thin, iron-colored shadow. We do not congratulate, the woman began. We inform, Hermione swallowed. Yes, Magistra, a brief evaluation. Your theoretical responses exhibit breadth unusual in candidates of your age. Your references to Prussian sources were surprising. The faintest crease touched her brow, not quite disapproval, not quite approval. Your German comprehension is sufficient for written tasks when given time. Your spoken production is uneven, Hermione's mouth tugged into a prim line. I am aware, I am improving. The woman's gaze did not soften. Your practical control is adequate, your wand discipline is tense. You struggled with second-year spells as if casting them for the first time and took multiple attempts for quite a few. Hermione's cheeks burned. Yes, Magistra. Hermione Granger had been a first-year, a Muggle-born, gawky, awkward, overeager. A girl who cried herself silly in an empty bathroom and got clubbed by a troll as a result. Everyone at Hogwarts knew that girl, even if they pretended not to. But a third year. No one would ever connect Hermione Granger with a half-blood German cursebreaker's daughter admitted directly into Durmstrang's third year. It was a chasm too wide for suspicion to cross, or at least, Hermione hoped so. She drew herself up, eyes cool and steady. Magistra, she said carefully, I believe you are correct. I am ready for the third year. The grey-haired woman's eyes flickered. Was that approval? So be it. Capel produced another parchment and slid it across the table. This one bore a wax seal stamped deep with the rune of Durmstrang. Beneath her name, written in a harsh, formal script, was a placement Dritzjar, Val Angenamen. Below that, a list. Required texts, thick tomes with unfamiliar Gothic titles, a note about uniform alterations, and a section marked Walfetcher electives. She read them quickly, brown eyes bright despite herself. You must choose two, the Magistra said. Your schedule will be set accordingly. An owl must reach the Institute within the week with your decision. Hermione nodded, already running permutations in her head. Runes was rather useful for translating old books and such. Rituals well, the more magic, the merrier. Dueling seemed a tad bit violent for Hermione's tastes, but could give her more practical grounding. Unless ethics was where the true intellectual challenge lay focus. One thing at a time. She looked up sharply. Magistra, there is one complication, a flicker of an eyebrow. Yes, my guardians, she lowered her voice. They are muggles, not tolerant ones. They believe magic is wrong, dangerous. Evil, she kept her expression even steady, as though this were simply another exam answer. If I am to attend Durmstrang, they must never suspect what kind of school it truly is. They must see only what they expect to see: a German boarding school, classical curriculum. Latin, history, philosophy. The woman regarded her for a long, cold moment. Then, you ask us to conspire in your lie. Hermione met her gaze without blinking. Yes, Magistra, or else I will be forbidden to come. A silence stretched. Then the Magistra inclined her head a fraction. We have precedent. A small number of our students require parallel documents. We can provide such for you. Hermione's throat unclenched. The Magistra went on, still crisp. A professor will be assigned to serve as external contact should inquiries arise. He will know enough of Latin and history to play the role if needed. We will construct the fiction of an academy in Germany with letters, timetables, and tuition records to match. Hermione bowed her head quickly. Thank you, Magistra. Do not thank, the woman said flatly. We expect results. You will not disgrace the Institute. Hermione's throat loosened so suddenly she nearly gasped. Yes, she breathed, then firmer, carefully enunciated. Yes, I understand. Good. The woman rose. Master Capel will return you to the landing ring. Your return portkey activates on the half hour. Capel turned without commentary. Hermione gathered the papers with careful fingers, as if any show of haste might make them vanish, and followed. They walked in silence. The fortress swallowed sound. Their footfalls were neat, disciplined, two metronomes clicking toward the future. When they emerged into the bright, thin northern sunlight again, it struck Hermione like a revelation too warm for her cloak, too bright for her nerves. Capel stopped at the circle of carved stone. "A note, Freyelin," he said, voice quiet enough that the wind nearly took it. "You aim to the right when you think too quickly. Aim where you mean to, not where you fear you will miss." Hermione blinked up at him. "Yes, Master Capel," she said, prim and earnest, and tucked the advice into the most guarded part of her memory. He handed her a different coin iron this time, stamped with a thinner rune. 1:30. She checked the sky, then the wall clock fixed above the arch. 2 minutes. She swallowed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, though she could not have said exactly what for. Capel inclined his head once without a smile, turning to leave. After what felt like an eternity, the portkey warmed up, and Hermione was finally whisked away. Chapter 4. Meet the Grangers. It had been 2 weeks since the examination, and Hermione had thought the restless nerves would have faded by now. They hadn't. If anything, they'd grown sharper, a constant vibration at the back of her mind. Hermione had once again snuck away to Diagon Alley to owl Durmstrang of exactly what she wanted them to tell her Muggle guardians. Now, the false papers from Schloss Falkenstein internatly on her desk, stamped and signed with perfect, plausible authenticity. Letterhead, crests, photographs of slate-roofed buildings nestled against mountain slopes, it was all there. Shed presented them dutifully to Mum and Dad. They had frowned, examined every line, tapped the paper with long dentist fingers as though pressing for cavities. Skeptical still. Skeptical but not dismissive, which for her parents was as good as victory, and yet that wasn't what Hermione was fretting over tonight. On the bed before her lay a parchment shed nearly worn thin with rereading. The electives list. 5 choices. Only 2 permitted. Magical dueling and warfare. Rituals and symbolic magic. Study of magical beasts. Ancient runes. Magical ethics and wizarding law. Hermione bit her quill until the feather looked bedraggled. Ancient runes was essential, surely intellectual, foundational, a discipline respected by scholars across Europe. It would sharpen her translation skills, let her unlock texts most witches her age couldn't dream of parsing. But then magical ethics and wizarding law was practical, too. Power meant nothing without knowing the frameworks it operated in. Except, of course, she couldn't ignore dueling and warfare, or rituals, or the beast she groaned into her pillow. "It's like telling me I can only breathe with one lung." Her wall clock ticked in a maddening rhythm. Shed filled 2 whole ledgers with Procon charts, and still nothing settled right in her chest. Then a knock at the front door. Hermione sat up, frowning. She wasn't expecting anyone. Mum and Dad weren't either, they'd said as much during supper. She heard a pair of footsteps, and then Dad warmly saying something likely a greeting to whoever was at the door, then an answer. A woman's voice. It was low, measured, and shaped by an accent Hermione couldn't quite place, but could recognize as vaguely Eastern European. Hermione froze. Mum's voice followed, both cautious and curious, and after a moment the stranger's tones swept in once again. Hermione's pulse quickened. She set her parchment aside, creeping out of her bedroom and padding silently to the landing to better hear. She had asked, half dreading, half hoping whether Durmstrang could provide a representative. And now, unless she was very much mistaken, that representative was standing in her family's hallway. With a quick breath in, Hermione practically flew down the stairs in her haste. When she jumped off the curved bullnose step at the bottom, Hermione found her gaze pass past her parents to find a woman who looked as though she belonged in a portrait. The strange woman was rather pretty, but not in a typical manner, no. Her beauty was a strange one, with far-apart eyes that seemed almost slit-like, a high forehead, and harsh features that seemed put in almost ridiculous contrast with her full cheeks. She was young for a professor, at most in her 30s. Her dress was a refined charcoal grey, and her hair, ink dark, was drawn neatly at the nape of her neck, but her slight smile softened the sharpness of her cheekbones. "Ah," the woman said in a thick accent, "this must be Miss Granger." Mum stood a little stiff, arms folded, while Dad looked halfway between curious and impressed. Hermione smiled nervously, hands twisting at her sides. "Yes, Hermione. You're from the school, right?" The woman inclined her chin in acknowledgement. "Dasha Varric. I work with admissions and family outreach at Schloss Falkenstein." Her words came easily, with a precision that sounded educated rather than foreign. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I thought it important to visit in person, given your understandable concerns." Dad brightened, seizing on the civility. "Well, that's certainly thorough. Most schools wouldn't bother with house calls." "Yes," Mum began, smiling tightly. "That is rather wonderful, isn't it? Although I find it quite curious Agerman School would do such a thing. Did you just happen to be in the area?" Varric nodded quickly. "Oh, yes, I was in the area, of course. London is a popular tourist spot. I simply came here because of your daughter's letter to the school about her parents' concerns." Schloss Falkenstein wouldn't dare risk such. Her gaze slid to Hermione for a moment. Gifted student. Mum looked at Hermione too, raising her eyebrows, her smile somehow tightening even more. "Yousn't her here, then?" she asked, before forcing a fond laugh and looking back at Varric, shaking her head. "Well, I appreciate your dedication to your job, even when you're not really supposed to be doing it at all. Hermione's really such a spirited girl, isn't she?" "I hope she is," Varric said politely. "Passion is the defining quality of any student, after all." "I suppose," Mum replied simply. "Anyway, MS. Varric, would you like to have a seat on the couch? Some tea too, perhaps. If you work in family outreach, you must be very familiar with the identification packet, and I'd just love to have the chance to pick your brain more about what I saw on it, if you don't mind." "Oh, I am reluctant to spurn such kindness," Varric said, albeit stiffly, "but tea is unneeded. I am not thirsty. As for the packet, it is always a challenge to translate an education such as ours into terms comfortable for families unfamiliar with continental academies. We at Schloss Falkenstein just want you to see that there is nothing hidden, nothing mystical about what we do. Your daughter will receive a rigorous classical education. Ask away on the specifics, but that is the core of the matter." Hermione felt her hopes dim a bit at that. This woman didn't seem much likely to win over Mum at all. Mum liked a specific sort of person, someone very lively and with much cheer, but with an intellect and knowledge to match. That's why she married Dad, Hermione supposed. Although Mum herself hardly was that sort of person, and she still thought herself better than practically everybody else, so perhaps there was some hope. At least that was what Hermione had to tell herself. As Mum walked with Varric to one sofa, with Varric complimenting the small abstract art painting framed on the wall, which did make Mum preen a bit, Dad hated that painting greatly and took every opportunity to poke fun at it. Even though it was so small it was barely noticeable. Hermione and her father quickly got on to the other. "I ought to cover your eyes with how brutally Mum's gonna pick away at her," Dad whispered to Hermione, snorting before straightening up. "So what subjects does your school emphasize, exactly?" Varric sat with her hands folded across her lap, quite primly. "Languages, certainly German and Russian foremost, though we offer classical Latin as well. Sciences, both natural and theoretical. History and geography, with a focus on comparative European traditions. Art and ethics as well, to broaden our students' horizons. Physical education is a requirement, as the strength of the body is arguably as important as that of the mind. And mathematics, naturally. We hold that no educated student can do without it." Dad leaned back with a satisfied grin. "Sounds like you're trying to make little Renaissance thinkers out of them." "Yes," Varric replied, her tone neither boastful nor defensive. "That is precisely the goal. Discipline of mind and breadth of knowledge." Mum tilted her head, expression pleasant but her eyes narrowing. "And what sort of disciplinido you mean? I read that line in your materials. Rather vague, wasn't it? Not corporal, I trust. Privately, Hermione didn't trust that. She had taken a look at Durmstrang's rulebook, and it said nothing of having banned those sorts of punishments. Not at all, Varric said smoothly. Discipline of conduct, of focus. We encourage a certain austerity in daily life. Less distraction, more attention to the work at hand. The aim is to form not just clever thinkers, but resilient ones. Mum murmured with the air of one considering cross-examination in court. And how do you enforce that austerity? I imagine children need some measure of fun. You wouldn't want to stifle them entirely, would you? Varric's smile returned, faint but unshakable. Fun is never absent. But we teach our students to earn it. Work first, reward later. It is a philosophy not every child enjoys at the beginning, but one which serves them all their lives. Dad chuckled. I can think of a few schools here that might do with a bit of that. Mum didn't laugh. Her eyes slid toward Hermione, narrowing further, then back to Varric. So you want parents to send their children away across the continent for stricter versions of what they could receive here? Hermione felt her chest tighten. Varric, however, was unbothered. We do not claim to be for everyone. But for those with particular drive, with unusual aptitudes, the environment we provide can be transformative. Your daughter has already demonstrated initiative beyond her age. Our role would be to give that ambition a structure to direct productive ends. Hermione's cheeks burned at the compliment, though she wasn't sure whether it was sincere or calculated. Mum gave yet another thin smile. Structure. Yes, I suppose that's the word. Dad broke the silence with a good-natured grin. Well, I don't know about you, but I think it sounds rather promising. He gave Hermione a wink before ruffling her already messy hair. Not that Hermione needs more structure, she's practically her own parent half the time. Mum hummed. That is quite a good point, Richard. Hermione pushes herself hard enough as is. And to direct productive ends would mean what, exactly? From what I gathered, many of your alumni go into private research or government advisory positions. Correct, Varric replied smoothly. Some serve in prestigious international institutions. Some become scholars. And yes, we have students rise to influential government positions. It depends on the student, of course. That sounds awfully impressive, Hermione added, beaming hopefully at her mother. Right, Mum. Yes, Mum said slowly, but her eyes stayed trained on Varric, searching, weighing. It does. But don't you think there's quite a bit of too much focus on academics? There's more to the world outside of the library, dear. Unruffled, Varric sat a little straighter at that. Naturally, academics are paramount, but we recognize that the most effective minds are not forged by study alone. There are extracurricular societies, debate circles, alchemistry workshops, a fencing club for those inclined toward sport. We even maintain a small orchestra. Students must learn to balance discipline with expression. Dad perked up at that. An orchestra, eh? Hermione, you'd have competition for once. Hermione tried not to flush. She played piano, but she was hardly a virtuoso. Her parents just liked signing her up for random activities to entertain her. It was either that or a babysitter most of the time. Well, Mum began, her eyes narrowing. That does seem comprehensive, but I can't help but wonder how, even with all the hours in the day, students have enough free time to explore what followed was what felt like an eternity of probing. Mum tested every claim about curriculum, housing, student safety, post-graduation prospects, her questions quick, surgical, each one tipped like a spear. Varric fielded them all with an effortless poise, as though she had rehearsed every possible objection in advance. The cover store was watertight. Every detail of Schloss Falkenstein's classical curriculum seemed to align with a plausible continental elite boarding school. By the end, the greatest tension in the room, even considering Mum and Varric, was Hermione's own nerves, stretched taut as a bowstring. And of course, Varric was saying at last, our faculty keep their class sizes small. We pride ourselves on knowing each student personally, guiding them to their best path forward. Mum let out a low breath through her nose, folding her arms. She was about to say something, undoubtedly another flaw she claimed to see, but then, in a subtle motion, Varrick's sleeve brushed lightly against Mum's arm. Her gaze lingered, meeting Mum's eyes directly. For a beat too long, silence pooled between them. Mum seemingly forgot her words. Hermione felt a prickle travel the length of her spine. Something felt wrong, horribly wrong. Her mother's shoulders relaxed minutely, her posture softened, and when she spoke again, it was no longer with her previous sharpness, but with a surprising openness. That does sound thoughtful. Perhaps I was too quick to assume, Mum said consideringly, almost warmly. I suppose I can see the value of what you're describing, even if I am still not fully on board. Hermione's mouth went dry. Did she just? No, that wasn't possible. Or was it? Durmstrang despised both Muggles and Muggle-born. She knew that much, and yet was this what they did? To mess with someone's mind like it was their favorite toy on the playground. She darted a glance at her father. He looked startled, blinking, eyebrows raised at Mum's shift, but not alarmed. He hadn't seen it, not the way Hermione had, because he didn't know this woman was a witch. He couldn't have, because Hermione had crafted this entire lie to begin with. Hermione swallowed hard, pressing her palms together in her lap, and said nothing. Her heart pounded. Maybe I am overthinking it. Mum could be having a real change of heart. Somehow, she doubted that. The conversation wound down quickly as Mum seemingly lost her sharp eye for new angles of attack. Dad, for his part, grew increasingly convinced the school was exactly the sort of challenge Hermione needs. Mum actually began to nod along, which made Hermione's stomach roll even though she supposed she should be jumping with joy. At last, Varrick glanced at the mantel clock and folded her hands together. I must not intrude any longer. I am certain you value your privacy, and my own train back to the city centre will not wait for me. Mum, to Hermione's near disbelief, offered her hand warmly. Of course, of course. Thank you for coming by. Truly. It was my duty, Varrick replied. She shook Dad's hand next, then turned slightly toward Hermione. Her smile was gentle, almost maternal in its polish. It was an honor to meet you all. I hope Miss Granger, her dark eyes flicked to Hermione, settling heavy like a weight takes after her family. Dad beamed, oblivious. Mum smiled, touched, though still faintly guarded. To them it was a simple kindness, but Hermione's stomach lurched. She stood frozen on the hall rug as the front door closed behind Varrick. Her mind whirled. She was an idiot, a complete and utter idiot who could memorize books. She had woven the story so carefully Hermione Morgenstern, orphaned half-blood, biological parents shed invented from whole cloth, and rebranding her real ones as adoptive. Shed thought herself clever and thorough, even. And yet her nose, her chin, her hair, her skin. She was her parents' child in every line of her face. Anyone with eyes could see it. Varrick had seen it. The smile, the parting words, the way her gaze had lingered. Oh yes, there was no doubt Varrick knew. Perhaps Durmstrang would too, soon enough. Chapter 5. Durmstrang. Days slipped by like sand through her fingers. Hermione lived them taut with nerves, each morning half expecting to hear the tap-tap of an owl at her window bearing a letter of rescindment. She didn't know whether Varrick knew. Hermione thought she looked too much like her parents to not be exposed, but perhaps, an absurdly hopeful corner of her mind thought, Varrick couldn't see the nuances in foreign features. Still, her one chance at a true magical education could be revoked at any moment. She thought of it constantly, wondering what the letter would say. What was even the word for a Muggle-born faking wizarding lineage? In her dreams, she imagined the wordsblood theft, or some tosh like that, but that seemed a tad dramatic in her mind. But no owl came. And as such, the letter it was supposed to bear seemingly had forgotten to exist. There was no heartbreak for Hermione. Nothing. The silence gnawed at her, but it was silence nonetheless, and that was a blessing on its own. In fact, even more blessings quickly came, as her parents had decided to let her go to Durmstrang, not that they knew what they were truly allowing, of course. Still, life demanded choices. The electives had weighed on her more than any examination. 2 out of 5, the parchment had said, and it felt like being told to choose between breathing and eating. She wanted everything: ancient runes, magical law, beasts. Knowledge, after all, was why Shed built the lie in the first place, but she couldn't have everything. So at last, she made her choice: magical dueling and warfare, and rituals and symbolic magic. The only ones that promised magic, real, structured, dangerous magic. Law and ethics she could read about later, runes she could puzzle over in her own time. Beasts, well, Shed already survived a troll, and that was quite enough of that, really. Her quill had scratched out her decision with a kind of terrible finality. Then, one more stolen trip to Diagon Alley, one more owl slipped away with her parchment. She ordered the elective textbooks as well, and at last, the Durmstrang uniform. Each visit drained her dwindling savings more and more. She'd been so responsible before, saving her parents' generous allowance and her grandmother's freely given pounds for years. And now she doubted it could pay for a decent day out. And if that wasn't what was stopping her from any more currency exchanges at Gringotts, it was the fact that the amount of Muggle money that could be swapped for wizarding money was restricted anyway, as she remembered McGonagall telling her on their first Diagon Alley trip, although she didn't know that exact limit. She supposed she would have to find that out for herself, but Hermione didn't allow herself a moment of rest. No, she drowned herself in preparation. The third-year core texts had already arrived. Thank God Shed ordered them right after the entrance exam, and were splayed around her bedroom. Charms, transfiguration, arithmancy, dark arts theory, she wasn't sure her hands should even be touching. There had even been a rather concerning illustration in the third chapter of a body, after using the rupturing curse on it, although, to the book's credit, the author did warn against using it on humans you weren't yet sure you wanted dead. Nonetheless, Hermione threw herself into each textbook with the desperation of someone racing a clock. Hermione's room looked less like a bedroom and more like the war camp of some scholarly general. Books were everywhere, monopolizing the entire space. She sat cross-legged on the floor in her fluffy socks, one text on transfiguration propped against her knees, and another on natural magic spread across the carpet. She scribbled notes so fast her quill squeaked. Remaining animate traits in inanimate objection pos state competitiveness. No, it means efficiency in this context. Of course, German ought to be a plainer language. Really, no, that doesn't matter. Focus, focus, she muttered to herself, flipping back to an earlier diagram that showed a meerkat to a small statuette. The connection had seemed odd at first, but she supposed it made sense. One of the most important parts of transfiguration was drawing connections between the initial and intended things. And, in German, meerkat was das Erdmännchen, which literally meant little Earthman. The correspondence visualization factor is a little confusing. Is it all so different for the inanimate to animate transformation than with the animate to inanimate ones? The book really should touch more on that. The doorknob rattled. Hermione froze, eyes widening in sheer horror. She'd forgotten to lock it. She'd locked it ever since she had first hatched up this awful plot. The door creaked open, and in walked her parents, smiling faintly as though they'd stumbled upon something novel. "Well," Mum said with a lift of her thin brows, "look at that. An unlocked door." "I told you at DB," Dad said cheerfully, already stepping in. "She's probably had it open for ages, we just never tested it till now." Hermione nearly died. Ages. She had just been sloppy today. Frantically, she tried to surreptitiously throw her transfiguration textbook under the bed, but instead it just banged off on the end. "Mum, Dad, hello, I was just studying, as one does. Can't ever be too prepared." Dad peered around, delighted. "Good grief, kitten, did you empty the entire library?" He leaned over, squinting at a page before Hermione practically threw herself across it. "Well, it's school books," she blurted. "That's why it's in German. Roman 2 can't afford to be behind after all." "I always read my school books before the school year starts, don't I? How else will I know I'll do well?" Mum laughed lightly, shaking her head. "You're already ahead of your peers," she said, snorting. "Have Yama children before. Awful, stupid little gremlins." It doesn't matter if they're the ones here or some snobby continental brats. You could sleep through the next year and still be ahead. You push yourself too hard sometimes. Do I? Hermione squeaked, flushing. She slid her notes an inch higher to cover the Transfiguration textbook diagram well, you know me. Can't be too careful. You and Dad taught me that. And you even pushed me to read Cicero when I was 7, remember? Dad chuckled, ruffling her bushy hair. She's got us there, Jean. We were giving her doorstoppers to read practically as soon as she was taller than them. Yes, well, Mum said primly, that was a different matter. It was just one little speech, and it was necessary to supplement that book on Roman history I'd given her. I said she pushes herself to be too hard, not that she shouldn't be pushed at all. Dad and Hermione shared a look, both laughing. Oh, yes, yes, laugh it up, Mum said, albeit a small smile tugged at her lips. How is it that I'm always the one being ganged up on? I suppose 9 months of extra effort count for nothing, and whoever knows how many more months of effort I put into Richard. He's my true firstborn in many ways. Hermione laughed at that too, while Dad looked back at Mum, mock offended. Uncalled for. I've always been mature. I was the best student back in dental school. Mum raised her eyebrows. Second debiest, I meant, of course, corrected Dad quickly, smiling. Funny how words get forgotten like that, really. Although, honestly, I only said best because the idea of even comparing you to anybody else seems insulting, with how large the gap was between you and everybody else was. Oris, I suppose I should say, because you're the best dentist in all of Britain, obviously. Mum snorted. I'd say flattery gets you nowhere, but the existence of Hermione over here proves that wrong, doesn't it? Hermione's face went pink again, though this time for a different reason. Mum, she protested, scandalized. Her father barked a laugh. See, proof positive. You win every argument, Jean. Truly, your debating prowess is beyond reproach. Your brilliance is that of 1,000 suns, probably why Hermione's so smart. Mum waved a hand, as though brushing off the compliment, but the corner of her mouth betrayed her with the faintest smirk. Well, I don't think I can't take full credit. You contributed a modicum, Richard. A modicum. Dad put a hand dramatically over his heart. That's cruel, even for you. I'd say I contributed at least a what's bigger than a modicum. A tad. Hermione buried her face in her notes to hide a giggle, which also conveniently covered the spell models she had drawn out. You contributed unwashed laundry and empty teacups on every surface of my flat, Mum replied dryly. And somehow I still married you. That's because I was a McCatch, Dad declared proudly, and you knew it, still do. Mum rolled her eyes, less a catch and more something that hurtled at me. Just couldn't dodge in time. She turned to Hermione then. So, jokes aside, how are you finding the books? I hope that woman wasn't just acting like the school was so demanding if you're finding it a breeze. Oh no, the material is all very, very difficult, Hermione said, and for once she wasn't lying. It's dense, but there's also just so much. It's much harder than anything I had to get through in primary school, of course, and in Irwell, this past year at Comprehensive. Her parents glanced at each other momentarily, and Hermione knew they had caught onto the Silent which had practically screamed. Well, that's great then, Dad said, smiling. We just swung by because we were planning on picking up some dinner. Didn't want you to get worried we just up and left. You used to get quite fussy about that. Beauty doubt you've had time to look up from all these books to notice, actually. Such is the cost of being prepared, Hermione replied, attempting to mirror his smile. The last days of August arrived like a countdown clock Hermione could hear ticking in her bones. Her gaze practically never left the history textbook for a good few days, until Mum finally put her foot down and said no reading during meals, at least. Even then, Hermione's dedication to finishing and then rereading every single text was second to none. Piles of her course books leaned against her desk legs like silent guards, and a portkey, a smooth, heavy iron coin, embossed with a rune she couldn't quite identify, sat on her desk too, glinting ominously in the lamplight. Durmstrang had sent this one too, and been precise in its instructions. Touch the coin at 9:00 a.m. sharp on August 30th, and she would be whisked away to the school gates. She had read the letter so many times it had nearly worn thin. The morning of August 30th dawned grey and heavy, the kind of sky that looked as though it might weep at any moment. Hermione was up before her alarm, already dressed, and her trunk was practically bulging with all her stuff. And of course, it was hardly the clothes and shoes that were disproportionately contributing to this. Rather, practically all the magical books Hermione had bought over the past year. By this time, Hermione had made her best attempt at a forgery for a plane ticket, a perfectly ordinary-looking itinerary to Auerbach, printed on crisp airline paper. Hermione had shown it dutifully, and then tucked it into her bag with careful hands, her chest buzzing with nerves. She wasn't going to Germany by plane. She wasn't even going by train. In fact, she was quite sure Durmstrang wasn't even in Germany, if anything. Scandinavia seemed a great deal more likely a location. Hermione was leaving by portkey at precisely 9:00 a.m. from wherever she touched it. And she had to do so without her parents ever knowing. The drive to Heathrow felt endless. Hermione sat in the back, her suitcase beside her, clutching her satchel far too tightly. Mum kept glancing at her through the mirror, offering small comments, reminders to eat something on the plane, to keep her money belt tucked away under her blouse, to mind her luggage. Dad hummed as he navigated the early traffic, the kind of cheerfulness that made Hermione's throat tighten. When they finally pulled up outside the crowded terminal, Hermione felt her palms dampen. People surged around them with rolling suitcases and children in tow. Flight announcements boomed from the loudspeakers, and the entire place pulsed with restless motion. It was a perfect cover, really. "All right, Poppet," Dad said, unloading her suitcase. "Shall we walk you in?" "No," Hermione squeaked a little too sharp. She coughed, adjusting quickly. "I mean no, it's all right. You don't need to. The gate's through security anyway, isn't it? You'd only be waiting around. It'll be fine." Mum narrowed her eyes. "Hermione, Mum, please." Hermione's voice cracked despite herself. She tried to smile, but her stomach rolled. God, she thought she could vomit on the ground right now. "I'll call as soon as I land. I promise." Her parents exchanged a look, the sort that spoke in volumes without words. Finally, Mum sighed, drawing Hermione into a quick, fierce hug. Dad followed with his usual warmth, ruffling her hair one last time. Hermione forced herself to walk briskly into the terminal, suitcase wheels rattling behind her. She kept going until she found the restroom, hurriedly entering a stall. She wrinkled her nose. Immediately, the smell of bleach couldn't quite disguise the faint reek of something less hygienic, but there was no choice. Balancing on tiptoe, she swung her bag onto the hook, unzipped it, and pulled out the blood-red Durmstrang robes. The wool was heavy, the cut sharp, almost militaristic. Stripping off her blouse and skirt, she changed as quickly as she could in the cramped space, careful not to let any hem graze the floor. Her reflection in the scratched metal dispenser by the door made her pause. The robes looked quite a bit more imposing than the Hogwarts uniform had. She stuffed her Muggle clothes deep into the satchel, adjusted the high collar, and pulled out the iron portkey coin. It was already warming, a pulse beating against her palm. "Here we go," Hermione whispered to herself. The warmth spiked into heat. Then the familiar, awful hook yanked behind her navel, and Hermione staggered forward as the bathroom stall twisted and blurred. With a rush of wind and the sudden crack of displaced air, she landed hard on stone. Around her, students were popping into place in ones and twos and threes, all clad in those same crimson robes. Hermione straightened, clutching her trunk and her satchel tighter, and lifted her gaze. There it was again, Durmstrang. The squat, solidly built black stone fortress sat carved into the cliffside, practically swallowing the bright, cheery summer sunlight. Jagged mountains framed it like sentinels, their peaks scarred with snow, while the thin, glassy lakes below shivered in the wind. Hermione's eyes darted to the students materializing around her. Their crimson robes flared in the wind, cut close to the body, and nearly all of them stood with a straightness that made her feel slouched by comparison. They moved differently too, not in jostling clumps of chatter like Hogwarts first years had, but with an odd sort of self-containment. They spoke amongst each other, yes, but hardly with the sort of loud exuberance that children normally displayed. Even the youngest carried themselves with the clipped posture of cadets. At the foot of the cliff stood the same man who had led Hermione to the entrance examination weeks before, Master Capel, looking as severe and wiry as ever. "Form lines," he called out, by year, left to right. The effect was immediate around Hermione. The red-robed students shifted and sorted with a speed that made her blink. At least 200 students, perhaps more, spanning from small, uncertain first years to towering seventh years, somehow organized themselves with the efficiency of soldiers. Hermione, not knowing any other third year, just made her way to those who looked about her age or older. Hermione stepped back slightly as a dark-haired boy only a little shorter than her stumbled over his own boot and went sprawling onto the carved black stone. A few nearby students smirked, but no one offered a hand. He scrambled upright, brushing off his knees quickly, his face burning crimson as he tried to rejoin the line. Capel's gaze flicked toward him briefly. 2 years here and still struggling, he said, without breaking stride as he passed the boy. And they say our standards are too high. They trekked up the castle cliff for many minutes. Some students whispered to each other all the while, but Hermione stayed silent. She was a very talkative person usually, but didn't know quite what to say now. "Leave your trunks," called Cap once they reached the crest. "Then come in." The command was simple, but it carried the weight of a spell. The lines shifted in perfect synchronization, boots clicking against black stone as the students began to file through the fortress-wide iron doors. Hermione followed, reluctantly leaving her trunk behind but keeping her satchel close, her eyes darting everywhere at once. The entrance hall was much smaller than Hogwarts had been, but still large, with vaulted ceilings braced with rib-like beams of dark oak and stone floors polished to a mirror sheen. Massive iron sconces held torches with no flames, just orbs of magical light. There were no portraits, no moving staircases, no tapestry of cheerful witches waving hello. The only thing that seemed magical at all was a relief carved in black stone depicting 7 runes intertwined. And then they entered the great hall, where the air smelled faintly of iron and resin. Hermione's first thought, when she saw it, was that they had definitely decorated over the summer. Above the long, heavy tables arranged there, light came not from chandeliers, but from long, floating shards of crystal that hovered high above, turning slowly on invisible axes. Each one glowed with contained lightning small veins of pure, caged energy. It was ridiculous, almost, how seriously Durmstrang took that no flames for non-magical purposes rule. Ridiculous, but impressive. Hermione swallowed, following the other third years toward the 4th table from the front. There were no houses here, but 7 long student tables stood before a raised dais where the high table waited. It seemed one was for each year, even if unofficially some students definitely broke ranks, which was quite practical, Hermione supposed. She slid into a seat halfway down, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. Her cloak pooled heavily around her, still too large in the sleeves, and she tried not to fidget. A moment later, the boy from before the one who had fallen sat beside her. His dark hair was even more unkempt up close, a cowlick standing defiantly over his left temple. He didn't look at her at first, just adjusted his bag and muttered something in a Slavic-sounding language that seemed self-deprecating. Hermione risked a small, polite nod. He caught it, blinked, and offered a quick, crooked half-smile before glancing back toward the dais. At the high table, the professors had already taken their seats, and in the center stood a man Hermione supposed was the headmaster, Igor Karkaroff. He cut an impressive figure. Hermione thought him as tall as Dumbledore, and perhaps as thin, too. His curled goatee barely hid his weak chin, and when he smiled slowly, his yellow teeth looked as if they would send Hermione's parents into shock. Still, his robes were perfectly neat and pressed, layered with fur at the collar and cuffs, so he clearly put some care into his appearance. He raised one long-fingered hand, and the murmuring hall fell instantly silent. "Welcome," he began, his voice oddly friendly. "To those returning, welcome back to your home. To those newly accepted, welcome to your future. At Durmstrang Institute, we do not make grand promises," Karkaroff continued, pacing slowly before the staff table. "We do not speak of comfort or ease. Here, you will be tested. You will learn that discipline is not the opposite of freedom, but its foundation. You will learn that strength is not given, it is earned. And you will learn that magic, true magic, answers only to mastery. Your mentors will guide you," Karkaroff said. "Your failures will teach you. And your ambition will determine how high you rise. I expect excellence. I reward excellence. And for those who do not yet know how to find it," he smiled, sharpened, "you will learn." He spread his arms slightly, and the crystals above flared bright in unison, a low hum filling the air as runes along the tables glowed in response. The air itself seemed to vibrate with restrained magic before. Just as suddenly, it all faded back to stillness. The hall erupted into applause. Hermione clapped with the rest, though her palms tingled faintly as if the magic had brushed against her skin. At once, food began appearing upon the long tables, and the smell hit Hermione almost immediately. She blinked down at the spread before her. A platter of smoked fish gleamed with oil. Beside it, bowls of pickled vegetables floated in brine, their colors almost two sharp reds and yellows like warning signs. Something that looked alarmingly like meat jelly-quivered faintly on a silver tray. There were dark loaves of bread that looked dense enough to bruise knuckles, and a tureen of soup so black she couldn't tell what was in it. Hermione hesitated. The boy beside her, who'd been quiet until now, reached for a ladle and began spooning the black soup into his bowl without ceremony. "Is it edible?" she whispered before she could stop herself. He glanced at her, puzzled. "It's kvass soup," he said. "Bread, beet, garlic. Yowl like it." Hermione wasn't entirely convinced, but she managed a polite nod, reaching instead for a slice of bread that seemed the least threatening option. She tore off a piece, bit into it, and tried not to wince. "Dense, sour, and just a little stale." She said, attempting brightness, "this is certainly hearty." The boy gave a small laugh, more of a puff of air than a sound. "You get used to it." "I expect I will," Hermione said briskly, smoothing her napkin on her lap. Then, in her most officious tone, "You've been here a while, haven't you?" He nodded. "Third year." "Oh, good," Hermione said, a little too quickly. "I am new, obviously." Hermione Morgenstern, transferred from, she hesitated. "From England." "I know," he said. "Everyone does. We don't get transfers." Hermione flushed faintly. "Yes, well, I imagine it's rather unusual. I was accepted here after some correspondence with the school. I am very advanced for my age, actually. It only completed well, never mind that. I am prepared, of course. Read all the course books front to back." The boy nodded again, expression mild. Hermione couldn't tell whether he was impressed or simply tolerating her. After a pause, she asked, "Do you have a name?" He blinked, then smiled awkwardly. "Oh, right. Emil Novak." "Ah." Hermione straightened slightly. "And you've been here 2 years already, you said?" "Yes." "What's it like?" "The classes, I mean. The professors. The magic here seems rather more structured than I am used to. Not as much whimsy, if you know what I mean, though that might be an improvement, honestly. Some of the teaching methods at other schools are rather lax. Structure's always a good thing, right?" Emil stared at her for a second before shrugging. "It's hard," he said simply. "They don't let you fall behind." "Well, that's fine," Hermione said primly. "I don't intend to fall behind. I've never fallen behind in any of my previous schools. I've always been ahead." She tore another piece of bread, chewing with the determined air of someone proving a point. Around them, the hall was filled with chatter in half a dozen languages. A tall, pretty girl across the table, with sharp cheekbones and pale hair braided tight against her scalp, leaned forward slightly. "You are the English one, yes?" Hermione nodded. "Yes, Hermione Morgenstern. And who might you be?" I am awfully nervous to be coming in as a transfer student, but I really do hope to get to know all of my classmates. You're a fellow third-year student, yes. The girl's eyes lingered on Hermione's bushy hair, then back down. You talk a lot. Hermione stiffened. Well, it's important to establish context, she said, her voice tight but even. Otherwise, how does anyone learn anything about one another? The girl smirked faintly. Emil's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, clearly torn between intervening and pretending not to notice. Hermione forged on. I suppose it's an adjustment, but I am certain it'll manage. The curriculum looks rigorous, and that's exactly what I wanted. I've already read ahead a little, of course. All of the magical theory is really quite fascinating, although I still struggle with the German translations. Oh, do Jam. She said this last part in sudden, desperate hope, peering toward a jar at the far end of the table. Emil swallowed a laugh. Plum jam. Probably. Well, would you mind terribly? He obliged, scooping some of the deep purple preserve onto her bread. Hermione had meant just for him to pass it, but she supposed that was fine too. Y'all get used to the food, he said again, quiet and kind despite his obvious amusement. "I'll have to," Hermione said firmly, taking a dignified bite. It wasn't quite as bad this time, quite being the operative word. Emil smiled awkwardly. She caught it, straightened her shoulders, and said with prim satisfaction, "Well, at least something here isn't entirely unpalatable." The girl across from them snorted. Emil ducked his head to hide a grin. But suddenly, as Hermione was still struggling to eat that awful bread by slathering as much jam as possible on it, a ripple of silence passed through the table. Mistress Varric was pleasantly smiling as she glided down the aisle between benches, sheafs of parchment in her hand. When Varric reached their section, she paused, glancing down the table with the faintest flicker of recognition. Her eyes lingered on Hermione for half a second longer than anyone else's. Hermione's spine went rigid. "Schedules," Varric said, "and dormitory rosters. Third years, you know your groupings. If you don't, I'll check you for signs of memory charms." Small laughs burst from the students. Varric handed out the parchments with swift precision, and when she reached Hermione, she placed the folded parchment before her without comment. When she moved on, Hermione exhaled very carefully, then unfolded her parchment, looking for her dormitory assignment first. Hermione Morgenstern Dormitory, North Tower, Chamber 3 assigned partner. Iva Emil, beside her, leaned in just enough to read the name upside down and promptly choked on his drink. Hermione blinked at him, affronted. "What?" He wiped his mouth hastily with his sleeve, avoiding her eyes. "You are well, you've Gotova." "Yes," Hermione said primly. "I can read." He laughed weakly, though the sound was more like a cough. "Right, just well, she's what?" Hermione asked, voice edging into that dangerously polite tone that meant she wouldn't drop the matter until she was satisfied. "She's not really a people person," Emil said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She doesn't talk much, or at all sometimes. And when she does, it's well, she's not very friendly." Hermione sniffed. "You shouldn't say things like that. It's rude to make judgments about people you don't know well." Emil gave her a look that was half amusement, half warning. "I know her well. We've been in classes together for 2 years." "Then perhaps you just didn't make an effort," Hermione said briskly, reaching for another slice of the bread she loathed. "Some people are shy, misunderstood. I am sure she tried to make friends before, but they all just cruelly rejected her, and so she just stopped trying." "If you say so," Emil murmured. "I'd say so," Hermione replied tartly, spreading another aggressive glob of jam over the bread. Across from them, that blonde girl was giggling with other girls over something or other, and Emil's gaze darted toward her, then away again, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate. He seemed to be quite desperate for her to talk to him again. Hermione felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy, though she immediately buried it beneath her usual briskness. "Don't worry," she said, a little too loudly, as if to reassure herself. "I am sure we'll both have a perfectly fine year. I am not concerned in the slightest about rooming with someone new. It'll be educational, And I hope we can even become friends eventually if the rooming arrangements are here to stay. Emil said, not sounding convinced. I mean, Hermione continued, warming to her own voice, if a Drazik can't possibly be as bad as everyone says. It's probably just school gossip. I am certain she's quite lovely once you get to know her. Emil finally glanced at her, a small, crooked smile tugging at his lips. Then you're braver than most. Hermione lifted her chin. I am practical. There's a difference. He chuckled under his breath and went back to his food. Lunch continued for at least half an hour before a small chime sounded, almost unnoticeable. Still, the effect was instantaneous. One moment, the hall was filled with the scrape of cutlery and low conversation. The next, the sound of benches clattering back and hundreds of boots striking stone filled the air like thunder. No closing speech, no cheerful dismissal. Students simply began filing out with mechanical precision, older ones first, moving like a trained cohort, the younger ones swept up in their wake and hurrying to keep up. Hermione blinked, still clutching her timetable. No prefects, no orientation, no maps. Hogwarts had been many things unsafe, apparently, but it at least had offered directions. Here, students simply scattered like rats. Emil was already rising, gathering his own parchment. You'll figure it out, he said mildly, noticing her hesitation. North Towers this way. He gestured vaguely toward the throng of students streaming through a side archway. Right, Hermione muttered, tucking her parchment against her chest and trying to keep pace. I'll just follow the crowd then. Emil smiled awkwardly, or he said, nodding down the hall, follow her. Hermione turned just in time to see the girl he meant, Iva Drazik. She was nothing like what Hermione had imagined from Emil's tone earlier. Not tall or intimidating or particularly striking. She was small, slight, with pale, almost translucent skin and soft brown hair twisted into a braid that brushed the middle of her back. Her uniform looked a size too big, sleeves buttoned tightly around her narrow wrists, the hem of her cloak just barely not brushing the ground. If anything, she looked like she might vanish in a strong wind. That's the unfriendly one, Hermione thought skeptically. The halls of Durmstrang were as severe as its exterior, narrow and high-ceilinged, lined with dark wood and iron sconces that shone with orbs of bright white spell-light. The crowd thinned as students broke off down branching staircases or disappeared behind heavy doors. Hermione hurried after Iva, trying to appear like she knew exactly where she was going, clutching her robes so she wouldn't trip. Every time the crowd surged, Hermione lost sight of her, and every time she panicked that she'd have to actually ask someone for directions. The other students didn't look particularly approachable. Most spoke in brisk, clipped tones. A few barked laughter that sounded more like challenge than humor. By the time Hermione caught sight of Iva again, they descended 2 winding flights of stairs and crossed a drafty landing lined with narrow windows. The view outside was breathtaking mountains and lake glinting under pale sunlight, but Hermione barely spared it a glance. She hurried the last few steps to keep Iva in view just as the girl turned sharply and pushed through a heavy oak door marked North Tower. Inside, the light changed. The corridor here was narrower still, the air cooler, and the floors gleamed with old polish. Small brass nameplates gleamed beside each door. Iva moved halfway down the hall before stopping at Chamber 3. She pulled out her wand. Hermione's heart jumped and pressed the tip to the lock. There was a brief shimmer of red light, then the door swung open with a faint click. Hermione froze at the threshold, unsure whether to speak. Iva glanced back, her gaze cool, faintly curious, as if registering Hermione's existence for the first time. Then she stepped aside, silent, gesturing Hermione in with a small motion of her hand. Hermione hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping past her into the chamber. The dormitory was smaller than Hermione expected, far smaller than the airy Hogwarts towers she remembered. The walls were made of the same black stone as the rest of the fortress, their surfaces faintly glimmering with what might have been embedded runes, or perhaps worse, just centuries of polish and soot. 2 large beds faced each other on opposite sides of the room. each draped in blood-red blankets and framed by a carved wooden headboard bearing the Durmstrang crest. Between them, two armoires and a pair of desks were jammed together as if daring their occupants to compete for elbow room. A small door in the corner, mercifully, seemed to lead to a private bath. Hermione exhaled in relief at that. If there was one thing she feared more than trolls, it was communal bathrooms. Her trunk had already materialized neatly beside her bed, as though it had always belonged there. Iva seemed to linger outside before finally coming in and closing the door. Hermione naturally sprang into action. "Hello," she said brightly, clasping her hands together and giving her best insociable and competent smile. "You must be Iva." "I am Hermione Morgenstern." Iva blinked. "Yes." Hermione forged on, undeterred. "I am ever so pleased to be your roommate. It's all quite new to me, of course being at Durmstrang, that is. I read all of the core textbooks, though, and the supplementary ones. It's such an intriguing curriculum, so rigorous. Especially the transfiguration sequence, which, between you and me, I've always had something of a knack for." Hermione nodded earnestly, taking that as encouragement. "Though I am a bit worried about the dueling elective, to be honest. I've never been in an actual duel before unless you count the tone time, but it wasn't really a duel. It's in its own category altogether, really. Oh, and what did you pick?" "The electives, I mean. Rituals, dueling." Hermione's face lit up. "Oh, splendid. Well, be in the same ones, then. That's so convenient. Maybe we can study together. I am sure we'll both learn so much. I've been revising the stances and wand movements and such already, though I wasn't entirely sure if the Durmstrang forms would be different from what's standard, are they?" "You'd know, of course." "Different." Hermione paused. "Right, different how exactly?" "Faster." "Ah, faster. That's good to know. I'll make a note of that." "Oh, and after unpacking, do we have any formal activities, orientation, or are we just supposed to explore? Is there a map of the school? I'd Levito see the library. Actually, do you go often?" "Yes." "Is it large?" "Yes." "Oh, well, that's just great. Maybe we could explore it together. I am sure there's just so many interesting things to find." Iva had already crossed to her trunk, wordlessly unpacking her things with slow, deliberate precision. Hermione tried again, voice a touch too chipper. "And how are your fellow students? Friendly, I hope." Iva glanced over her shoulder. "Not really." Hermione clasped her hands tighter, her voice tilting toward nervous laughter. "Well, that's good to know." Iva shut her trunk, straightened, and met Hermione's gaze for perhaps the first time. "Don't worry," she said flatly. "They will leave you alone. Eventually." Hermione wasn't sure whether to feel reassured or alarmed, but nodded nonetheless, trying to seem perfectly composed. "Well, that's thank you, I suppose. I am sure I'll adjust quickly. I always do," said Iva. Hermione smiled too brightly. "Yes, well, splendid talk. I'll, start organizing my quills then." Iva just gave a small all right, sat on her bed, and opened a book, its cover blank, its pages lined with some strange script Hermione couldn't identify. The only sound in the room for the next half hour was the rustle of parchment and Hermione's determined unpacking.